Dang it. Now I've gotten to the point where I'm getting ready to put the IRS unit back in Ol Tex. And I've had this out because both of the output shaft seals were leaking. Bearings seemed to be okay, but the seals were not. So I had to replace the seals. Actually, I had to replace the entire output shafts for reasons that I'll explain in another episode. But at any rate, it's all back together, and when you have one of these things out on a stand, it's really a great opportunity to take a look at a lot of stuff and make sure that everything's going well. Now, as far as the brakes are concerned, we're going to do a separate episode on these brakes because it does take a little bit of time to do that. But just basic stuff, like for example, right here we have the flexible hose that attaches to the main tube that comes from the front of the vehicle from the master cylinder and activates the two calipers that you see here. Okay, good time to take this, bend it around, see if you can see any cracks. This one looks like it's been replaced. I mean, not like 5 years ago, but it's not an original. It's still very good. So I'm going to keep that. It would not be particularly expensive to replace it, but whatever. So, and also, these things tend to rust, particularly in northern climates where you got road salt in the wintertime. These things, because of the fact that all the salt rolls from the front end of the car and finally it all accumulates here, all this stuff can rust pretty easily. But this car being from Texas, you don't see a lot of rust issues on it. Another thing that is helpful to look at are these things. This is a hanger for the exhaust pipe that comes in the front, kind of takes a big U-turn over the axle shaft and then comes out the back. And there's a little rod that is welded to the top of that pipe that fits through here. Okay, and what happens is, more often than not, this plastic bushing kind of goes away. And also, again, in northern climes, the steel shell can rust, and this will allow the pipe to kind of hang free and vibrate against whatever it wants to. Now, where these are located, if you look right here, we got these two blind nuts or captive nuts with bolts that run through them. This thing fits on the bottom side. You won't be able to see it from there probably, maybe you can, right in there. Okay, and so it's just a simple matter, unless these things are rusted, then it's the same old deal, you know, heat, impact, whatever, to get these things out. So there's one here and there's one here. Now another thing that is important is for you to check your shock mounts. When they're hanging free, if they can move around, there should be, if these bolts are tight, there should be a little bit of resistance as you rock the shock back and forth. If it kind of flops around there, the bushing, which you have to take that bolt and this one and back off, those bushings, if you can find bushings, need to be replaced. Otherwise, guess what? You're buying at least one shock, if not, and if one's bad, the others typically are getting close themselves. Also true of the bottom shock bushings as well. That would be them right there. Now, in a previous episode, you saw me install the rear trailing arm, the rear trailing arm bushings. Okay, now what these things do is this bolts to the car, and as the suspension moves up and down here, this thing articulates like this. Okay, now what you're going to want to do when you reinstall this is you're going to want to get this tight enough so that these things are in a position where you can just simply take and fit them up into the spud that's sticking down from the bottom of the car, torque everything up without having to swing it up, and it's an extra hand for you to do this. Now, once you've got both control arms torqued in and attached up front here, And by the way, before you attempt to install them, these should be roughly pointing straight ahead. Once you've got them fitted up front here, what you need to do is you need to put the car on jack stands underneath the hub carriers. And the purpose of that is to allow this bushing to sort of seek its natural neutral position. Okay? Now the reason for that is that if you, let's say this was down at an angle, this point was down here, what you'd have to do is you'd have to force this control arm up to attach it to the forward mount. And even sitting in your garage, this bushing would be twisted. And that would accelerate the rate at which this thing needs to be replaced again. This thing normally, as the car goes up and down, this control arm's doing this. But what you don't want to do is have it doing this and twisting it. You might even be able to see that twisting in there. You don't want to see it, have it do this while it's sitting at 0 miles per hour in your garage. And once you get it at that position, that neutral position, you then tighten this bolt right here. And you can see these locking tabs right here. Okay, once you got it tight, and you want to get it really tight, you want to make sure that you've got the locking tab that most closely aligns with a flat on the bolt. You can see that it's kind of like a little sunflower here all the way around. Okay, find the one that aligns most closely with a flat on the bolt, and then tap it over. You don't have to do them all, just need to do one. And that bolt is locked in place. Now another thing that you want to look at in terms of general maintenance, and it's fairly important, is the hub carriers right here. There are two tapered bearings here that sort of face each other. They're sort of like a front wheel bearing setup. And in your front wheel bearings, you can adjust the amount of lash or preload on the bearings by simply turning a nut and moving them further together or further apart. And there's a certain specification for that. Same thing here. You got a bearing here that the cone faces inward. You got a bearing here where the cone faces outward, and you can adjust that by tightening this bolt, or this nut rather, and noting the amount of clearance or movement. You can see this one moves a fair amount right here. There's a specification for what that is, and that's way too much. I haven't actually begun the process of adjusting it yet. But let's say that I tightened this thing up and got it torqued to spec, and there was no play. This wouldn't move at all. That would mean that there is no space between the bearings and their races. Now, what adjusts that is not this nut. This nut just takes everything in this hub here and just kind of sandwiches it together. What there's inside of here that adjusts that gap is one of these little guys. This is off of my shelf of many things here. I think that's too big. Yep, that's a big one. There. For the XJ series of cars and the E-types, I believe this is the size that you need. This fits in between the end of this flange here, this hub that is splined and the axle goes through, and the face of the axle shaft that fits in. And you can adjust how much play there is between the bearings by varying the thickness of these. So what you would do is you would take a dial indicator, which measures in thousandths of an inch, and you clamp it on here, put it on here, and then move this back and forth like this. And then the dial on the front would show you in thousandths of an inch what the play is in the bearings. What you want is between 1 and 3 thousandths. This, by the way, to give you some idea of what measurements are, 4 thousandths of an inch is the thickness of an average sheet of copy paper. Okay, so let's say that you're at 4 thousandths. Well, you need to tighten it up at least 1/1000th of an inch. You got a few thousandths to play with there. What you would do is you would take this apart, pull the axle shaft out, and you would then extract this shim, and then find one in the little box over here. That is, in our case, we'd want it to be 2/1000ths thinner. That would allow this whole thing to mash together a couple of thousandths, and then reassemble everything, and then torque the nut, and then use the dial indicator again to measure how much it's moving. Okay? Now, a word about this nut here. There is a specific torque for this to be. Do not just take an impact and bang this thing on, because there's a lot of these that have actually broken off because some unknowledgeable mechanic just banged this thing together. And there's also, by the way, it's a castle nut, as you've observed, and once you get it tight, and what you want to do is basically pick the closest one of these slots that lines up with the hole that goes through here. It can be a little bit looser, or it can be a little bit tighter, but do not bang it on with an impact. So, I wish I'd have taken more video going through here, because there's a lot of things that I haven't covered here, just sort of doing some things that I've got time to do, and so, but it's not like there won't be more opportunities to go through this stuff. So, there you go. I would say one more thing before I put the rear IRS unit back in, Ol Tex. Now is a great time to install these things right here, because when you get them under the car, or when you get the IRS unit mounted in the car, you're not going to have as much freedom in terms of vertical space to work with underneath here between the floor and the bottom of the cage unit. It's just easier to deal with this stuff now rather than later, when you got to figure out how to get them. And by the way, one thing that's really important, and mistakes that a lot of people make, is that they make the mistake of trying to get this pipe up here to go in here at the back of the IRS, hook up, and then come out the front here. It ain't gonna happen. It's physically impossible. It's not how it's designed. So that's what it ought to look like right before you put it in. Bob Canote, signing off, Camp Chaos.